Mute Orphan saves a dying pony. Years later, the truth leaves everyone in tears. The air in the horse trading market was thick with dust and sweat, filled with the sharp scent of hay and the restless stomping of hooves. Buyers moved in clusters, their eager voices blending with the occasional whinnies of stallions being led to display. Everywhere, strong, well-groomed horses pranced under the sun, their muscles flexing, their coats gleaming. Trainers called out prices, ranchers haggled, and coin exchanged hands in rapid succession. The energy was alive, except for one forgotten corner where a pony lay on the ground, barely breathing. No one stopped to look. No one cared. The pony had once been beautiful, perhaps even majestic, but those days were long gone. His silver coat, once sleek and dazzling, was now dull and caked with mud, his ribs visible beneath his scarred flesh. Deep cuts lined his legs, old wounds that had never fully healed. His mane was tangled, his body trembling with exhaustion, his large dark eyes staring into the void. He did not flinch when feet kicked up dust around him, nor did he react when a careless trader nearly stepped over him. He had long since learned that struggling was pointless. Nearby, a group of men stood, watching a young stallion being auctioned off. "Now that's a horse worth having," one of them said, nodding in approval. "Powerful legs, smart eyes, that beast will work for his master." Another scoffed, glancing toward the pitiful heap that was the wounded pony. "Unlike that one, can't believe they even bothered bringing it here. That thing's already halfway to the grave." Laughter followed. The pony heard it, but he did not react. He had grown used to being invisible. But someone saw him. A small boy stood at a distance, gripping the sleeve of his grandfather's coat. His eyes, wide and filled with something deeper than pity, locked onto the dying creature in the dirt. The boy was thin, with unkempt brown hair and clothes that had been mended one too many times. His lips parted as if he wanted to speak, but no sound came. He never made a sound. Peter had never spoken a word in his life. Yet, in this moment, he did not need words to understand the pony's pain. He tugged harder on his grandfather's sleeve, desperation flashing in his gaze. The old man, a rugged farmer with hands hardened by years of work, followed Peter's stare. His expression softened when he saw the pony, but a heavy sigh left his lips. "Ah, lad," he murmured, shaking his head. "He's too far gone." Peter didn't move. His fingers curled into fists, his eyes pleading. The old man exhaled slowly. He knew that look. It was the same look his grandson had when he was just a baby, silent but determined. And so, despite knowing it was madness, he placed a hand on Peter's shoulder and nodded. "All right, boy, let's see if we can save him." The old man led Peter through the crowded market, their steps slow and deliberate as they approached the pony's pitiful form. Peter walked ahead, his heart pounding in his chest. The closer he got, the worse the pony looked. His breathing was shallow, his sides barely moving. Flies hovered around his wounds, feasting on the open cuts that had never been given the chance to heal. Peter crouched beside him, reaching out a trembling hand. He wanted to touch the pony's mane to reassure him, but something in the pony's empty stare warned him to stop. This was not a creature that trusted humans. A low chuckle came from behind them. "Well, well," a rough voice sneered. "Didn't think anyone would be fool enough to take an interest in that one." Peter turned to see a man leaning against the market's wooden fencing, his arms crossed over his thick chest. His name was John Whitaker, and he was known throughout town as a ruthless horse trader. His dark eyes gleamed with amusement, and a smirk played on his lips as he studied Peter and his grandfather. The old man straightened, his voice firm but calm. "How much?" John barked a laugh. "For him," he spat at the ground, shaking his head. "Boy, I was planning to put him down tomorrow, but since you're so keen," he rubbed his chin, pretending to consider it. "Let's say 5 silver pieces." The old man's eyes narrowed. 5 silver pieces was practically nothing for a horse, but even that felt like a waste of money for something so close to death. Peter wasn't listening. He dug into his pocket, pulling out a small cloth pouch. Inside were a few crumpled coins, his personal savings, gathered from doing odd jobs around the farm. He held them out to his grandfather, eyes pleading. The old man hesitated, then sighed. He pulled out a few more coins from his own pouch and placed them in John's outstretched palm. "That's all we have." John snorted, tossing the coins between his hands before shoving them into his pocket. "You're mad, old man. That beast won't last a week." Peter didn't care. His focus remained on the pony, who still hadn't moved. His grandfather patted his shoulder. "All right, lad, let's take him home." But when they tried to lead the pony forward, he didn't move. John smirked. "See? He's already given up." Peter refused to believe that. He knelt beside the pony again, not touching him, but letting him see his face. Slowly, carefully, he placed a small piece of apple on the ground between them. For a long moment, the pony did nothing, but then, with a slow, trembling motion, his nostrils flared and he inched forward, just enough to sniff the offering. Peter's heart leapt. It was small, but it was a sign. With great patience, they coaxed the pony into taking slow, hesitant steps. The market noises faded behind them, and after what felt like hours, they finally reached the cart waiting at the edge of town. It was clear that the pony had never been in one before. His ears twitched at every creak of the wheels, his body stiff as they helped him inside. Peter climbed in beside him, sitting close but not too close. The pony's muscles were still coiled, tense, ready for pain. But Peter did not touch him, did not force him. Instead, he simply sat there, and as the cart rolled forward for the first time, the pony's gaze flickered toward him, not in fear but in curiosity. The journey back to the farm was long, the road uneven, the air thick with the scent of tilled earth and dry grass. Peter did not speak, he never did, but his grandfather occasionally murmured words of reassurance. "We'll take care of him, lad, don't you worry." The pony Arthur, Peter decided, remained silent, his eyes half-lidded in exhaustion, but he was still breathing, and that was enough for now. When they finally arrived, Arthur's hooves scraped against the wooden planks of the stable as he stepped down. His legs wobbled, nearly giving way. Peter instinctively reached out to steady him, but Arthur flinched violently, baring his teeth. The old man pulled Peter back gently. "He's been hurt bad, son. Give him time." And so time was what Peter gave him. For the first few days, Arthur refused everything. He wouldn't eat the hay left in his stall. He wouldn't drink from the water bucket. He wouldn't even look at them. He stood with his back turned, staring at the wooden walls, as if he had already accepted that this was the end. Peter, however, had no intention of letting him fade away. Each morning, before the sun had fully risen, Peter left a fresh bucket of water and a handful of hay near Arthur's stall. He never forced Arthur to take it. He simply made sure it was there. Each afternoon, Peter sat outside the stall, scratching shapes into the dirt with a stick. Sometimes he hummed softly. Other times he simply sat in silence. And every night, as the world grew quiet, Peter would return to the stall's entrance and sit beside the wooden beams. Waiting, watching, hoping. And then, one evening, everything changed. It was just past sunset, the sky streaked with deep purples and soft oranges. Peter had just placed down a small bucket of water before turning to leave, but this time he heard movement behind him. Slow, hesitant, he turned. Arthur had stepped forward, just enough for his nose to hover over the water bucket. His ears flicked back, his body still tense with caution. But after a moment he drank. Peter barely breathed. He didn't move, didn't dare break the fragile moment. Arthur drank deeply, and when he finally lifted his head, his gaze met Peter's. Not with fear, not with anger, but with the smallest flicker of something else. Something Peter had not yet seen in those eyes. Trust. It was small, so small that no one else would have noticed it, but Peter did. And that night, as he lay in bed, he smiled for the first time in a long, long time. Arthur was choosing to live, and this was just the beginning. Days turned into weeks, and still Arthur resisted. He ate and drank, but only when no one was looking. He never allowed Peter to come near, never let him touch him. Whenever Peter stepped too close, Arthur's ears flattened and his muscles tensed, ready to defend himself if needed. The scars on Arthur's body told the story of his past, one of suffering, of cruelty, of betrayal. But Peter didn't need words to understand. He had known what it felt like to be abandoned. He had known what it felt like to be unwanted. So, he waited. Every day Peter came to the stable. Sometimes he sat just outside the stall, watching the gentle sway of the trees. Other times he brought a book and read aloud, though his voice never left his throat. The words stayed inside him, unspoken, but he traced each one carefully, letting them fill the silence. And slowly, so painfully slowly, Arthur began to notice. One evening, as the last light of the sun bathed the farm in deep amber, Peter sat with his knees tucked to his chest, scribbling shapes in the dirt. Arthur stood at the far end of the stall, his head low. His eyes were half-lidded, distant, as if his mind were somewhere far away. Then, without a sound, he moved. A single step forward, then another. Peter felt the shift in the air before he even looked up. His breath caught as he saw Arthur standing closer than ever before. Peter didn't move, didn't even blink. Arthur stared at him, ears flicking, nostrils flaring slightly as if he were testing the scent of this strange, silent boy who never hurt him. And then, so softly, so briefly, Peter almost didn't believe it. Arthur lowered his head, reaching toward the dusty ground between them. For the first time, Arthur was watching him. Not with fear, not with distrust, but with something fragile, something that had been buried beneath years of pain. Curiosity. That night, when Peter went to bed, he didn't sleep right away. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his chest warm with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The first touch came in the early morning, just as the sky was shifting from deep blue to soft gray. Peter had just placed a small piece of apple on the wooden railing, the way he did every morning. But instead of stepping back as usual, he stayed. Arthur hesitated. His ears flicked, his tail swished, his large dark eyes darted between Peter and the apple. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he stepped forward. The weight of the moment made Peter's heart race. He could feel it thudding in his chest, a drumbeat of anticipation. Arthur lowered his head, sniffed the apple, paused, and then, for the first time since he had arrived at the farm, Arthur took something from Peter's hand. Peter felt the soft warmth of Arthur's breath on his skin, the brush of his velvety muzzle as he took the apple in his teeth. Peter didn't move, didn't breathe. And then, as quietly as a whisper, Arthur nudged Peter's palm with his nose. It was not much, but it was everything. The weeks that followed were full of small miracles. Arthur stopped flinching when Peter entered the stall. He no longer pulled away when Peter reached out a careful hand. The deep tension in his body began to ease. And then, one day, something happened that no one expected. Peter had been leading Arthur to the open field behind the farm, just as they had done every morning. The wind was soft, carrying the scent of autumn leaves. Arthur's hooves pressed lightly against the earth, his steps careful but steady. But when they reached the field, Arthur stopped. Peter turned to see a shadow pass across the pony's face. His ears flicked back, his muscles stiffened, his eyes, so much softer now, filled with something dark, fear. Peter followed his gaze. The open field stretched wide and endless before them, so free, so vast, but for Arthur, it was a prison. For a long time he did nothing, and then, slowly, he turned away. Peter watched, confusion flickering in his eyes. He nudged Arthur gently, encouraging him forward, but Arthur would not move. He refused to step into the open space. Peter's grandfather stood at the porch, watching. His voice was thoughtful, gentle. "He won't run." Peter turned, his silent question clear. "He's free now, but he doesn't know it." The old man's gaze was sad. He spent too long in chains. Peter looked back at Arthur. The pony had lowered his head, his breath slow and heavy. Peter understood. Because he too had been locked in something unseen. The training began the next morning. It wasn't easy, it wasn't fast, but Peter did not believe in forcing things. He started small, walking beside Arthur, step by step. Each day, they went a little further. Peter never pulled, never pushed. And Arthur followed. The first run happened on an evening when the world smelled of rain. The sky had turned soft and gray, and the earth beneath them was cool. Peter and Arthur walked to the field, as they always did. And for some reason, this time was different. Arthur paused at the edge, his body tense. Peter took a step forward, then another, and then he ran. Not away, not out of fear, but because he wanted Arthur to follow. For a moment there was nothing but silence. And then Peter heard it, the rhythmic pounding of hooves. He turned and saw Arthur moving. Not just walking, not just trotting, running. Peter stopped, breathless. He watched as Arthur moved faster, 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 his mane streaming behind him like silver fire. His hooves struck the earth with power, his body alive in a way it had never been before. Arthur was not broken. He had never been. he just needed to remember. Peter's grandfather watched from the fence, a quiet smile on his weathered face. "Look at him," he murmured. "That's a pony worth more than gold." Arthur had become unrecognizable from the frail, broken pony Peter had saved months ago. His once dull, matted coat now shone a brilliant silver under the sunlight, sleek and smooth like flowing silk. His legs, once weak and trembling, now carried him with strength and grace. He no longer cowered in the corner of his stall, but stood tall, proud, his ears flicking forward as he watched over the farm. Word of Arthur's transformation spread quickly in their small town. Farmers, breeders, and horse enthusiasts began to take notice. At first, it was just a few curious glances. When Peter and his grandfather brought Arthur to town for supplies, people would stop and whisper. Some even followed them, murmuring about the impossible change in the once hopeless pony. Then came the offers. Wealthy ranchers rode up to their humble farm, stepping out of polished wagons or sleek automobiles, eager to make their bids. One man, a prominent racehorse owner, leaned against the fence one afternoon, eyes gleaming as he watched Arthur move across the pasture. "This pony," he murmured, "he's rare, special. I'll pay whatever price you name." Peter's grandfather, standing beside him, shook his head without hesitation. "He's not for sale." The man's brows furrowed. "You don't understand. A pony like this could be trained for high-level competition. Do you have any idea what kind of money that means?" Peter tightened his grip on the wooden fence, his knuckles going white. He didn't need to speak. His silence was enough. The man sighed, shaking his head. "You're throwing away a fortune," he muttered before tipping his hat and walking away. But the offers kept coming. A breeder from a neighboring town offered to trade 3 purebred stallions for Arthur. A businessman, enchanted by the pony's rare beauty, offered a large sum of cash. Yet time and time again, Peter and his grandfather refused. Arthur was not a product to be sold. He was family. Peter never forgot the day Arthur had finally trusted him, the moment when a terrified, wounded pony had let a mute orphan into his heart. No amount of money could replace that. Arthur had been abandoned once. Peter swore he would never let it happen again. And so, the visitors eventually stopped coming. But fate had other plans. One morning, just as the autumn leaves had begun to drift lazily from the trees, a black car rolled up the dirt road leading to their farm. It was sleek and polished, standing out starkly against the rustic simplicity of the countryside. Arthur, grazing peacefully in the field, lifted his head, ears flicking forward. The moment the door opened, something shifted in the air. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in an expensive suit that had no place in the dusty landscape. He moved with purpose, scanning the farm with sharp, intent eyes, and then he saw Arthur. The change in his expression was immediate. His composure, so refined, so controlled, shattered. Peter, who had been fixing a section of the wooden fence with his grandfather, turned to see the man standing frozen, his gaze locked onto Arthur. Then, without warning, Arthur moved. Peter barely had time to react before Arthur broke into a run. Not away, not in fear, but toward the man. Peter's breath caught. Arthur never approached strangers. He had spent months avoiding them, distrusting them, fearing them. But now, he was galloping forward, his powerful legs carrying him across the field with undeniable purpose. The man's hands trembled at his sides as Arthur skidded to a stop before him. A thick silence blanketed the farm. And then slowly, as if afraid the moment might vanish, the man lifted a hand. Peter tensed. He expected Arthur to flinch, to pull away. But he didn't. Instead, Arthur pressed his muzzle into the man's palm. Peter's stomach tightened. Arthur never let strangers touch him. Never. Yet now, he was standing still. The man's voice when he spoke was hoarse, thick with emotion. "Arthur." Peter's heart stopped. The man knew his name. Peter's grandfather stepped forward, his face unreadable. "You know this pony?" The man took a shaky breath. "Yes." His fingers curled slightly against Arthur's coat. "I've been looking for him for over a year." Peter froze. The man, William, reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded photograph. With careful hands, Peter's grandfather took it and opened it. Peter leaned in. The photo showed Arthur, but not the Arthur they had found at the market. This Arthur was radiant, his coat shining under the sun, and beside him, a girl. She was laughing, her arms wrapped tightly around Arthur's neck. The joy in her face was unmistakable. Peter's grandfather swallowed hard. "Who is she?" William's voice was heavy with something raw, something broken. "My daughter." Peter's breath hitched. William exhaled slowly. "Her name is Emily. Arthur was hers." Silence. Then William told them everything. Arthur had never been abandoned. He had been stolen. During a family outing, Arthur had been tied near a clearing while Emily played nearby. But something had happened. The rope had snapped or had been cut. When they turned around, Arthur was gone. They searched for months. Posters, newspaper ads, everything. But no one found him. And then Emily got sick. Peter's pulse pounded. "She has cancer," William said quietly. "The doctors told us she had 3 months left." His voice cracked. "That was over a year ago." Peter's hands clenched. "She's still holding on," William whispered, "and we know why." He reached into his jacket again, pulling out a second photograph. Peter didn't want to look. But he did. This one was different. Emily wasn't riding Arthur in the golden sunlight. She was lying in a hospital bed. Her face was pale, fragile. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, were now sunken and tired. But there was still something in them. Hope. "She still asks for him," William whispered. "Even now." Peter's chest tightened. William turned to him and his grandfather, his expression pleading. "Please," he whispered. "Let me take him home." Peter didn't want to let Arthur go. But before he could decide, Arthur made the decision for him. The moment his eyes fell on the photograph of Emily, something snapped inside him. Arthur let out a loud, anguished neigh. His hooves stamped the ground. His nostrils flared. He nudged the photo frantically, as if trying to reach her. Peter felt something burn in his chest. Arthur remembered. He had never forgotten. Peter swallowed hard. Then, with every ounce of strength in his heart, he nodded. Arthur had to go home, and he had to go now. The decision was made. Peter's grandfather agreed to let Arthur go, but it was Peter who led him to the trailer, his small hands trembling as he held the lead rope. Arthur hesitated for a moment, turning back to look at Peter, his deep, knowing eyes filled with something indescribable. Peter swallowed against the lump in his throat and gently pressed his forehead to Arthur's muzzle. His silence, as always, spoke volumes. "Go to her." Arthur snorted softly before stepping into the trailer, his hooves echoing against the metal floor. Peter backed away as William closed the ramp, securing Arthur safely inside. Then the trailer pulled away. Peter stood there, unmoving, watching until it disappeared into the horizon. The journey to the hospital was long and quiet. William sat in the front, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. Every now and then, he would glance at the rearview mirror, checking on Arthur. The pony didn't panic. He didn't whinny, didn't stamp his hooves. He just stood there, his ears pricked forward, staring straight ahead, as if he knew, as if he understood where they were going. By the time they arrived at the hospital, the sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, the sun slowly sinking beneath the horizon. William wasted no time. The moment the trailer door swung open, Arthur stepped out, his body tense with anticipation. "Let's go," William said, his voice thick with emotion. Arthur didn't need to be led. He followed on his own. Inside, the hospital was cold and sterile, the air filled with the quiet hum of machines and the hushed voices of nurses. Rebecca, Emily's mother, looked up the moment they entered. She gasped. For a second she stood frozen, her hand covering her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Then, without a word, she turned and ran down the hallway. William knew where she was going. He followed, Arthur walking beside him, his movements steady, purposeful. At the end of the hallway, a door stood slightly ajar. Inside, the room was silent. Emily lay motionless on the hospital bed, her skin pale, almost translucent. The faint beeping of machines was the only indication that she was still alive. William took a deep breath. "Emily?" Nothing. She didn't move, didn't open her eyes. Her breathing was so shallow, it barely stirred the blanket draped over her frail frame. William's hands clenched at his sides. "We're too late." And then, Arthur stepped forward. He lowered his head, his breath warm against Emily's hand. His soft muzzle brushed her skin. And suddenly, her fingers twitched. Rebecca gasped. "Emily?" Emily's eyelids fluttered. Then, slowly, painfully, she opened her eyes. Her gaze landed on Arthur. For a moment there was only silence, then her lips parted slightly, her voice no more than a whisper. "Arthur?" William felt his heart shatter. Rebecca sobbed. Arthur let out a deep, soft whinny and gently nudged Emily's hand again. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she lifted her trembling fingers, barely managing to touch his muzzle. "You came back," she whispered. Arthur didn't move. He just stood there, pressing his head into her palm. Rebecca buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. William turned away, his eyes burning. Emily let out a weak, shaky laugh. "I thought I was dreaming," she whispered. Arthur exhaled softly, as if to say, "I'm real. I'm here." Emily's fingers curled slightly against his soft fur. "I waited for you," she said, her voice barely audible. "I thought I lost you forever." Arthur stayed still, waiting, listening, loving. Emily's breathing grew slower. Her mother leaned over, brushing Emily's damp hair from her face. "Sweetheart, he's here now." Emily's eyes softened. She turned her gaze back to Arthur. "Arthur, I'm sorry for losing you," she murmured. "But it's okay now." Arthur nuzzled her cheek gently, his breath warm against her skin. Emily smiled. "I will wait for you in heaven," she whispered. Her fingers loosened. Her chest rose, one final time. Then it fell still. The hospital room plunged into silence. Rebecca let out a heart-wrenching sob, clutching her daughter's lifeless hand to her chest. William's knees nearly buckled as he turned away, his hands shaking. Arthur, he stood frozen, staring at Emily. His ears flicked forward, then back. He nudged her hand again, but she didn't move, she didn't respond, and something in Arthur broke. His head slowly lowered. A deep, heavy sigh escaped his lungs. For the first time in his life, Arthur bowed. To Emily. To the girl who had loved him. To the girl who had waited for him until the very end. They buried Emily in a quiet meadow on the William estate beneath a great oak tree where she used to sit with Arthur for hours, whispering her secrets into his ear. The funeral was small, intimate, family, close friends, and Peter. Arthur stood by her grave, and he did not move. Not for one day, not for two. For 3 long days he stood there, unmoving, his head lowered, his ears back. Peter sat beside him the entire time, his small frame curled up against the cold earth. He did not try to pull Arthur away. He did not try to force him to leave, because Peter understood. William and Rebecca has watched over them and cannot control their tears. He comes to Peter and broke the silence. "You should know, Peter, Arthur wasn't just Emily's pony. He was her best friend." Rebecca wiped her tear-streaked face, nodding. "He was everything to her." Peter looked at them, listening. William sighed, running a hand down his face, his exhaustion evident. "We were busy, Peter. Too busy," he admitted. "Our business demanded everything from us. Meetings, travel, constant work. We thought we were giving Emily a good life by providing for her, making sure she had everything she needed." Rebecca swallowed hard. But what she needed was us, and we weren't there. Peter's small fingers curled into the grass beneath him. "She never said anything," William continued. "She never complained, but we could see it, the loneliness, the longing for something more. And then we got Arthur." Rebecca managed a small, sad smile. From the moment he arrived, it was as if the whole world changed for her. Peter turned to Arthur, whose ears flicked slightly at Emily's name. "They were inseparable," Rebecca whispered. Arthur followed her everywhere. If she was reading, he was beside her. If she was playing, he was watching. If she was sad, he would nuzzle her until she smiled again. William exhaled, and then he saved her life. Peter's eyes widened. Rebecca hesitated, her hands trembling as she spoke. A year before Arthur disappeared, Emily was kidnapped. Peter's breath caught. William clenched his jaw. She had gone out for a ride, like always. But she didn't come back. We searched everywhere, called the police, sent out search parties, but nothing. Rebecca's voice broke. For hours, we had no idea where she was. It was the worst night of our lives. Peter could only imagine the fear, the desperation. And then William said something that sent a shiver down Peter's spine. It was Arthur who found her. Peter's heart pounded. "He escaped the stable that night," Rebecca whispered. "Ran off on his own. No one knew where he was going. We thought he was just scared." William nodded. But he wasn't scared. He was searching. Peter's fingers tightened around his own sleeves. "We got a call from the police," William continued. "They said a lone pony had been spotted frantically running through the woods, heading straight for a secluded cabin. It was as if he knew." Rebecca wiped her eyes. "When they followed Arthur, they found the place. They found Emily." Peter's chest tightened. She was tied up inside, William whispered, his voice shaking with the memory. Scared, crying, alone. But Arthur was outside, kicking the door, neighing, making so much noise that the kidnappers panicked. Rebecca nodded. That distraction gave the police enough time to get in and save her. If Arthur hadn't found her when he did, she swallowed, she wouldn't have survived the night. Peter looked at Arthur, his throat tight. The pony had always been a warrior. No wonder Emily loved him so much. William let out a ragged breath. She never forgot what he did. Never. Every single day she made sure he knew how much he meant to her. Peter glanced at Arthur, who lay still, as if he too was remembering. And then Rebecca's face twisted with pain. When he disappeared, Emily wasn't the same. Peter froze. She cried for weeks, Rebecca whispered. She refused to eat, refused to talk. It was like a piece of her had been ripped away. William rubbed his hands together, his voice hoarse. At first we thought she was just grieving, that the sadness would pass, but then she started getting sick. Peter's stomach dropped. She lost weight, Rebecca murmured. Her energy faded. She became too weak to leave her bed. William clenched his jaw. We assumed it was stress, that she just needed time to heal. Rebecca let out a soft sob. But we were wrong. By the time we took her to the hospital, it was too late. Peter felt his own heart breaking. She had cancer, William whispered, and it had already spread. Rebecca's hands shook. The doctors told us she had 3 months at most. Peter's chest ached. William let out a heavy sigh, but she held on. Peter looked at him, confused. She should have passed months ago. The doctors couldn't explain it, but we knew. William's voice wavered. She was waiting. Rebecca closed her eyes. For Arthur. Peter felt his throat close. William turned to him, his expression weary but grateful. And then you saved him, Peter. Peter's eyes widened. If it weren't for you, Arthur never would have made it back to her. William smiled, but it was a sad, broken thing. She got to see him again. She got to say goodbye. Rebecca reached out, touching Peter's shoulder gently. Thank you, she whispered, for giving her the ending she deserved. Peter's heart clenched. He had thought he was saving Arthur, but in the end, Arthur had saved Emily. And maybe, just maybe, Emily had saved Arthur too. Peter looked at the grave one last time. Then he turned to Arthur, and he knew. From this moment on, Arthur wasn't just his pony. He was Emily's legacy, and Peter would honor it forever. This story is about more than a pony and a boy. It's about love, about loss, about unbreakable bonds. Arthur was more than just a rescued pony. He was a promise kept, a promise that love never dies. What do you think? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that touch the heart.